Now, let us assume that some version of temporal causal finitism is true, which holds that there is some initial temporal world state that is the causal predecessor of all other temporal states of some causal sequence. So, the existence of some initial temporal world state is a given necessity for, since there are non-controversially are temporal world states, it follows conceptually and therefore by necessity that there is or was some initial world state of the causal sequence that is identical to or encompasses the causal history of our universe. So then, if by universal agreement we accept the necessity of the existence of initial temporal world states, we have to pose the question if temporal states are supposed to be the initial states of global causal sequences. Well, obviously, there have to be first temporal states, but are first states ever temporal ones? Why not? Well, if we accept some temporal state as the initial state of some causal sequence, we run into the usual complications that accompany all regular naturalistic metaphysics that are being called into question by various cosmological arguments such as the Kalam. For it may be asked, if some temporal state is the initial state of some causal sequence, then why is it not in need of some causal predecessor? And or what differentiates such an initial temporal state from all the subsequent ones, such that it is devoid of any distinct causal origin, temporal or other, unlike all the others? On grounds of inductive inference alone, we should conclude that temporal states are causally dependent upon prior states, since, by matters of empiricism, we should accept that those we are familiar with do. Additionally, besides temporal causal finitism or TCF, there is the plausible doctrine of ontological causal finitism or OCF, that demands for there to be some initial world state, temporal or otherwise, that is the causal predecessor of all other states, temporal or otherwise, of some causal sequence. So to engage in a little clarification, we should try to precisely define what we mean by temporal states, and therefore what we should accept as constituting a non-temporal state. Then, if we will be able to properly differentiate between temporal and non-temporal states, we should make use of the following procedure. We assume the existence of some initial non-temporal state, assume that it is the causal origin of the first temporal state, highlight the relevant differences of the two distinct types of states in order to come to understand how a non-temporal initial state evades the metaphysical complications that an initial temporal state faces, whereby we will come to properly understand the grounds for making use of the relevant distinction and why it really matters. So if we can define the term non-temporal state as well as the term temporal state in a way that we can construct a metaphysically robust scenario of the ultimate origin of some causal sequence, we thereby shall have put forward a strong case for the validity of our metaphysical approach. So first, let us define the term non-temporal state. Any state Sn that does not cause or bring about the existence of some subsequent state Sn plus 1 such that Sn plus 1 is temporally posterior to Sn by some kind of metaphysical necessity. Additionally, let us define the term world state. Any state Wt such that a complete description of Wt is a complete description of the actual world at some time t. So, some state Sn that cannot cause or bring about the existence of some subsequent state Sn plus 1 by metaphysical necessity, that is completely static and causally impotent, would surely qualify as a timeless or non-temporal state. If a description of such a state as N were the description of some exhaustive world state of the actual world, then this state would simply remain in existence as it is, and the actual world would simply remain changeless as it is. We should say timeless, for no change occurs. But surely such a state cannot ever have been the world state, for if this state Sn is identical to some world state Wt, the world state Wt at the present time should be a non-temporal state, namely the state Sn, at least if we abide by some very basic metaphysical assumptions. Then the question arises, if we do not allow for our initial non-temporal world state Sn to be causally inert, and if we do not allow for some non-temporal state to necessitate the existence of some subsequent state, what kind of causal relator do we ascribe to some kind of non-temporal state that can initiate some causal sequence not identical to itself? Well, such a state cannot be causally inert, nor can it relate to some subsequent state by relation of some other form of causal determinism, so causal indeterminism is the relevant causal relator intrinsic to such a relevant non-temporal state. For if by chance or libertarian determination such a state Sn causes or brings about some subsequent state Sn plus 1, then it doesn't do so by any form or kind of necessity, rather, the existence of such a subsequent state is a matter of contingency. So we have some non-temporal initial state as n that contingently causes some subsequent temporal state as n plus 1, which then brings about some subsequent temporal state as n plus 2, which is temporally posterior to as n plus 1. But what then should be a definition of temporal state? It seems reasonable to assume a naive definition seemingly implied by analogy by a definition of some non-temporal state as n. Any state as n that does cause or bring about the existence of some subsequent state as n plus 1, such that as n plus 1 is temporally posterior to as n with some kind of metaphysical necessity. But even given ignorance of the exact nature of their specific kind, we might believe it to be possible for there to be overriding reasons as to why some ordinary physical state that might be expected to necessitate subsequency by transitivity from nomological to metaphysical reasons might not do so due to the very overriding reasons, whatever their nature may be. Since a definition of state as in state as n is not exhaustive, meaning it isn't necessarily identical to some world state Wt. So for example, God may simply will some ordinary composition of physical objects existing at some time t that would suffice to constitute a relevant state as n to simply go out of existence prior to any time t star later than t. Surely it isn't properly feasible to attribute ontological necessity to the existence of some subsequent state as n plus 1 if as n is not identical to any world state Wt. So we shall define temporal state as any state as n that possibly does cause or bring about the existence of some subsequent state as n plus 1, such that as n plus 1 is temporally posterior to as n by some kind of metaphysical necessity. For such a composition of physical objects may indeed necessitate the existence of some subsequent state, and yet overriding reasons of metaphysical nature may as well prevent such a state from coming to be. So, having provided the necessary basic definitions, we may ask the relevant questions. If there is such a non-temporal state as n, such that it does bring about the existence of some subsequent temporal state as n plus 1 that is temporally posterior to itself by causal indeterminacy, why are we supposed to think of Sn as a non-temporal state in the first place? Sure, it fits our definition, but why think of said definition as a proper one for labeling some state a timeless one? Well, once again, Sn does have the causal disposition to remain wholly causally inert, so that if Sn is identical to some world state Wt of the actual world were to remain in a wholly timeless state. So possibly any world state identical to Sn is a timeless state, in the sense that no change whatsoever occurs. Apart from the acknowledgement of certain substantivist theories of time that accept passage of time in the complete absence of change, the usual consensus is time passes if and only if change occurs, in the sense that change occurring and nothing else necessitates such passage of time. Surely then, if Sn remains causally inert, Sn is a timeless state. And yet, what are we to make of Sn's supposed timelessness in case it actually does bring about some temporally posterior state as n plus 1? De facto, the situation seems identical to some supposed temporal state bringing about some subsequent state, does it not? So how can a state that does bring about some temporally posterior state be properly said to be timeless? Now, if we contemplate on what grounds we are to classify such state as either temporal or non-temporal, we should think of some relevant truth makers that ground the ontological classification of Sn. In case Sn remains changeless, and therefore uncontroversially non-temporal, it is supposedly its causal disposition to remain changeless that makes it true that we non-controversially think of Sn as a non-temporal state. But now, suppose we were to think of Sn as a temporal state, in case Sn indeterministically brings about some subsequent state as n plus 1, what would make it true that Sn should be thought of as temporal? Surely, it is the same causal disposition inherent in or intrinsic to Sn that we could make reference of. The difference in question is the existence of some state distinct from Sn, namely Sn plus 1, but we plausibly should think of the relevant truth makers that provide grounds for classifying a state as either temporal or non-temporal as inherent in, or better yet, intrinsic to some state itself. It should seem weird to think of some state distinct as well as non-identical to Sn to serve as a truth maker that determines the nature of that very state itself. And yet, if we were to classify Sn as temporal if and only if Sn brings about Sn plus 1, Sn plus 1 would have to serve as a truth maker for the proper ontological classification of Sn. Without such absurdity, the temporalist in question could only make reference to a sense intrinsic causal disposition that obviously suffices to classify Sn as non-temporal in case Sn+1 does come to be. So let us take a closer look at a metaphysical picture to see if everything fits. What we have is some non-temporal, that is, timeless state as n, that by some causally indeterminate procedure brings about the existence of some temporally posterior intrinsically temporal state as n+1, which in turn, by causal necessity, brings about the existence of some subsequent temporal state as n+2. It is well worth noticing that the first temporal state is the first state that temporally precedes the initial timeless state. This picture differs from the usual metaphysical picture as proposed by William Lane Craig, amongst others, that temporally locates the timeless cause of the universe as occurring simultaneous with, and yet ontologically without, the first temporal instance. Here, the relevant timeless cause is a timeless state that exists timelessly due to its own nature, that is, its own causal dispositions, and unlike Craig's timeless cause of the universe, has a posterior temporal effect, not an effect occurring simultaneous with the very cause itself.